He thought mocking me in court because I'm black would break me, but he didn't know I was about to tear down everything he built. What I did next not only destroyed his career, it made headlines across the nation. Stay with me until the end, because the last 5 minutes will leave you speechless. If you want more powerful stories that inspire and reveal the truth, hit that subscribe button and join our community. Don't miss what's coming next. They say there's a kind of silence that can crush you. It's not the peaceful silence of an empty street at dawn or the comforting hush before bedtime. No, this is the kind of silence that wraps around your chest and squeezes until your ribs ache. The kind that tells you, without a single word, you are out of place, unwanted, and beneath the people who stand around you. I felt that silence the moment I stepped into Courtroom 3B. The heavy wooden doors groaned as I pushed them open, their hinges sounding like they hadn't been oiled in a decade. The smell hit me first: old paper, stale coffee, and the faint tang of floor polish. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale, almost sickly glow over everything. The benches were half filled with strangers, all looking up when I entered. And in that instant, I could feel their eyes scanning me, cataloging me, not as a man, but as a type. My father used to tell me, the first thing people will see is your skin. Make sure the second thing they see is your strength. I used to believe him. But standing there, I realized something. Sometimes they don't bother to look past the first thing at all. I was there to fight for something simple, something that should have been straightforward. The small piece of land my father had left me when he passed away. It wasn't much, just a strip of dirt and grass at the edge of town. A place where, when I was a boy, he taught me how to plant collard greens in neat, proud rows. A place where my mother used to hang laundry under the summer sun, while my father sat in his old lawn chair, humming to himself. That land wasn't just dirt. It was history. It was the smell of my childhood summers. It was the place where I stood next to my father the day before he died, both of us looking out at the fading sunset. And he said, "Take care of this, son. It'll take care of you." I walked into that courtroom believing the law would protect what was mine. But then I saw him. The judge. His black robe was pressed crisp, the collar of his shirt white as bone. He was in his late 60s, with silver hair combed so precisely it looked like each strand knew exactly where it was supposed to be. His face was sharp, his jaw tight. But it wasn't his appearance that stopped me. It was the way his eyes locked on me as if he'd already decided something. You can tell when someone looks at you and doesn't see you. He didn't see a man with a case. He didn't see someone who had come to seek justice. He saw something else. I took my seat at the plaintiff's table, my lawyer beside me. We had prepared for weeks, documents, photographs, statements from neighbors. I believed evidence was enough. I was about to learn it wasn't. The judge picked up the file with my name on it, squinted at the cover, and then read my name out loud. Slowly, over-enunciating, breaking into pieces, and stretching each syllable like he was pulling taffy. There was a soft ripple of laughter from the benches behind me. I felt the muscles in my jaw tighten. My lawyer shifted uncomfortably beside me, clearly debating whether to object to whatever that was. But the judge wasn't done. He looked up from the file, directly at me, and repeated my name, this time with a slight curl at the end of his lips, the faintest smirk. It was the kind of smirk that says, "You don't belong here, and I'm going to enjoy reminding you of that." The first witness was called. My opponent's lawyer stood confidently, his suit perfect, his tone smooth. They spoke to the judge like old friends. Laughter, small talk, a rhythm that told me they'd danced this dance before. When it was my turn, I stood. My voice was steady at first. I explained the history of the land, the documents proving ownership, the will my father had left. But every time I spoke, the judge's eyes wandered. He tapped his pen. He sighed. He glanced at the clock. And then, midway through my testimony, he interrupted me. "Let's move along," he said, leaning back in his chair. "We don't have all day to entertain this." That word, this, it was said like I wasn't even human, like I was a thing, an inconvenience, a joke. I heard it in my bones. I saw it in the eyes of the people in the room, and I felt it deep in the pit of my stomach, the understanding that this case wasn't about justice anymore. It was about me. and the fact that I was a black man standing in a room where my presence was already a verdict. By the time the hearing was over, I already knew the outcome. His gavel came down with a dull, heavy thud, sealing my loss. Case dismissed, not because my claim was invalid, not because I had no proof, but because in his eyes, I had no right to stand there and be heard. I walked out of that courtroom in a haze, the sunlight outside feeling too bright, too harsh. My lawyer tried to speak, his voice sounding far away. People passed by me on the steps, their chatter blurring into a meaningless hum. But under all that noise, one thought burned in my mind. You're going to regret every word. It wasn't about anger, though I had plenty of that. It wasn't even about the land anymore. This was about something bigger. This was about making sure that the next black man or woman who walked into that room wouldn't be reduced to this. Revenge is a dangerous word. People think it's just rage and impulse. But the kind of revenge I had in mind wasn't going to be loud or quick. It was going to be precise, calculated. The kind of justice the law had failed to give me, I would take for myself. I started that night. At my kitchen table with a laptop and a pot of coffee, I typed his name into a search bar. I read news articles, court transcripts, old interviews. I made notes on everything: his career timeline, the cases he'd handled, the political events he'd attended. That wasn't enough. I dug deeper. I spent days in the dusty archives of the county records office, flipping through yellowed pages that crumbled at the edges. I pulled property records, old financial statements, even minutes from city council meetings. And slowly, patterns began to emerge. I learned who his friends were, who his enemies were. I learned which charities he donated to, which businesses he supported, and which ones he mysteriously ruled in favor of during disputes. Then, one night, buried deep in a stack of forgotten files from over 2 decades ago, I found it. It was a case so small, so seemingly unimportant, that no one had paid attention at the time. But the details were damning. The judge had been involved in a ruling that, if you looked closely, reeked of corruption. A property dispute between a wealthy developer and a single mother. On paper, it looked routine. But the timeline, the sudden disappearance of key evidence, the way the ruling favored the developer despite overwhelming proof to the contrary, it didn't add up. It wasn't just bad judgment. It was deliberate. And if I could prove that, it wouldn't just embarrass him. It could end his career. That's when the plan began to take shape. But I knew one thing. I couldn't go at this recklessly. Men like him survive scandals because their enemies rush in without thinking. I needed to be patient. I needed to make sure that when I struck, it was so devastating he wouldn't be able to recover. So I mapped it out. I gathered every piece of evidence I could find, making copies and storing them in multiple places. I spoke quietly to people who had gone up against him in the past, people who had been burned but stayed silent out of fear. The more I learned, the more I realized this wasn't just about me anymore. This man had been mocking and dismissing people for years, hiding behind that robe. I was just the latest in a long line of his victims. And I decided I'd be the last. Because sometimes the only way to make a man regret his words is to take away the platform he uses to speak them. And I was going to do exactly that. The deeper I went, the more dangerous the air around me felt. At first, it was just facts. Names, dates, connections, a map of influence and favors that stretched far beyond the courtroom walls. But soon, the facts began to pulse with something darker, something that told me I was stepping into a place where truth was guarded like treasure, and the people who owned it would fight to keep it buried. I realized quickly that the judge's power wasn't confined to the bench. He had woven himself into the fabric of the city. He played golf with the police chief. He attended fundraisers with the mayor. He sat on the board of a charity that, on paper, fed underprivileged children, but whose finances, I discovered, were full of missing pieces. The man wasn't just a judge. He was institution, and institutions don't fall easily. But I wasn't interested in knocking gently. I started with the corruption case from 23 years ago, the one that had whispered its truth to me from the dusty county archives. I read it until my eyes burned, tracing every line, every date, every signature. The same name kept appearing. A local developer who, back then, had been just starting his empire. Today, that man owned half the commercial property in the city. The ruling in that case had given him the leverage to buy land at a fraction of its value. That single decision had been the first domino in his rise, and the judge had been the one to tip it. I tracked down the woman who had lost that case, the single mother. She didn't live in the city anymore. Her address led me to a small, weathered house 2 counties over. The curtains were drawn, and her yard was overgrown, but she still answered the door. Her face carried the weight of years spent holding in a story no one wanted to hear. She didn't recognize me, but when I explained what I knew, she stepped aside and let me in. The living room smelled faintly of dust and lavender. She showed me a box she'd kept hidden in her closet. Old papers, photographs, and letters from lawyers who had long since stopped returning her calls. Her case had been airtight. She had proof of ownership, proof the developer had falsified documents. But days before the hearing, her key witness withdrew. Her attorney told her it was over before it even began. The judge had ruled against her in under 20 minutes. As she spoke, her voice trembled. Not from anger, but from the exhaustion of someone who had tried to fight and been crushed under the weight of a system built to keep people like her silent. I promised her I wouldn't let it be for nothing. From there, I began building a timeline. Every questionable ruling he'd made, every case that seemed to bend toward the wealthy, the connected, the untouchable. I found patterns in the companies he favored, many of them tied back to the same small group of people. But there was something else, something I hadn't expected. It started small, a quiet car idling across the street from my apartment late at night. Then came the feeling of being followed when I left the records office. Footsteps that stopped when I stopped. Shadows that seemed to linger just a little too long. I knew better than to ignore it. The judge had allies who owed him favors. If they thought I was digging into something that could hurt him, they wouldn't hesitate to make it clear I should stop. But fear has a way of sharpening your focus. Every time I felt it, I reminded myself of that courtroom. The smirk, the laughter, the word this thrown at me like an insult I wasn't supposed to answer. I wasn't stopping. I shifted my work to safer ground. Instead of using my apartment, I began working out of the public library, carrying my files in an old backpack. I stored copies of my evidence in 3 separate places, one with a friend out of state, one hidden in a storage unit under a false name, and one encrypted online. Then I began testing the waters. I leaked a small piece of information, nothing that could be traced back to me, to a local journalist who had a reputation for chasing stories others were too afraid to touch. A single email, sent from a public computer, containing details about a minor case from the judge's past that had gone suspiciously in favor of a company later found guilty of fraud. 2 weeks later, it appeared as a brief article on page 5 of the Sunday paper. No mention of corruption, just a summary of the facts. But I wasn't looking for headlines. I was watching reactions, and the reaction came fast. The judge released a statement dismissing the article as irresponsible reporting. The company's name was scrubbed from several online directories within days. That told me 2 things. 1, he was paying attention. 2, he was afraid. Fear is leverage, and leverage is power. The more I dug, the more I saw the cracks in his armor. He wasn't invincible. He was just careful. And careful men make mistakes when they feel cornered. I decided to widen the net. I contacted a retired court clerk who had worked under him for over a decade. She was hesitant at first, but when I mentioned the case from 23 years ago, her voice went quiet. She told me there were things she'd seen, files that had vanished from evidence rooms, transcripts that didn't match the actual words spoken in court. She kept copies of some of them, locked away just in case. When she handed me that envelope, my hand shook. Inside were documents that didn't just hint at corruption, they screamed it. Altered records, misdated rulings, handwritten notes that showed clear bias before hearings had even begun. I realized then that my plan was bigger than I'd first imagined. It wasn't just about humiliating him. It was about dismantling the myth of his authority so completely that no one could ever put him back together. But the higher you aim, the more dangerous it gets. Late one night, as I was walking back to my car from the library, a man stepped out from behind a lamppost. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The way he stared at me, cold, unblinking, told me everything. He was a warning. I drove home with my heart pounding, checking my rearview mirror every few seconds. It hit me then. I was no longer just digging into a man's past. I was threatening an entire network of power. And that network was starting to notice. But I couldn't turn back. Because I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for the single mother who lost her land. For the people whose cases had been tossed aside because they weren't worth the court's time. For every person who had walked into that courtroom with hope and walked out with nothing. And if that meant walking straight into danger, so be it. The trap was almost ready. All I needed was the right moment to spring it. And when it came, I knew it wouldn't just be the judge who fell. It would be everyone who had stood behind him, laughing. The day I realized the judge was finally feeling the pressure was the day I knew the end was near. It didn't happen in a courtroom, or through a news headline, or even in some dramatic confrontation. It was a single photograph, sent to me from an anonymous email address, that told me the balance of power had shifted. The image was grainy, clearly taken from a distance, but there was no mistaking him. The judge was sitting alone in his car, parked outside a downtown office building. His hands were pressed against the steering wheel, his head bent low, his mouth slightly open. He looked worried. I didn't know who had taken the photo or why they'd sent it to me, but it confirmed what I'd suspected. He knew someone was coming for him. He just didn't know who. And that uncertainty was my greatest weapon. I had spent months building the trap. Now I began closing it, one steel bar at a time. The retired clerk's documents had been my foundation. They were irrefutable proof of altered records, falsified timelines, and rulings that could not be explained as mere judicial discretion. But proof is only as powerful as the hands you place it in. And in a city where the judge had built so many alliances, I had to be careful who I trusted. I decided on a three-pronged approach. One, media exposure, but not from the local press, which he could easily influence. 2. Political leverage, targeting his ambitions beyond the bench. 3. Legal pressure, planting seeds that would grow into full-blown investigations. For the first, I reached out to a national investigative reporter I'd been following for years. Her stories had taken down CEOs, exposed fraudulent charities, and even triggered congressional hearings. I didn't contact her directly. Instead, I sent an unmarked envelope to her office containing a small portion of my evidence, along with a note. If you want the rest, meet me in person. It was risky, but I needed someone outside the city who couldn't be silenced with a phone call or a favor. The second prong required a different kind of subtlety. I learned that the judge had been quietly positioning himself for a seat on the state's Court of Appeals, a position that would cement his influence and protect him from local scrutiny. To get there, he needed political endorsements. I began sending select pieces of information, carefully chosen to raise suspicion, not outright accuse, to several key political figures known for protecting their own reputations above all else. The third prong, legal pressure, came from a source I hadn't expected. The single mother from that 23-year-old case had a son who had grown up to become a lawyer in another state. When he learned I was digging into the case that had destroyed his family's stability, he offered to help. He had contacts in federal agencies, people who wouldn't hesitate to investigate judicial misconduct if they had the right starting point. Piece by piece, the noose tightened. But as I moved forward, the threats became bolder. My mailbox began filling with blank envelopes containing nothing but a single playing card each time, a king of spades. My car tires were slashed twice in 1 week. Once, I came home to find my apartment door unlocked, though nothing appeared to be missing. They weren't trying to hurt me yet. They were trying to scare me into stopping. But fear is a poor deterrent when you've already decided you have nothing left to lose. The first real crack appeared when a national reporter contacted me. We met in a coffee shop 2 towns over, where the noise of the espresso machines drowned out our conversation. I slid the rest of my evidence across the table. She read in silence, her eyes narrowing, her jaw tightening. This, she finally said, is going to ruin him. She left with the files, promising to dig into every thread I'd uncovered. A week later, whispers began to spread, not about me, but about him. Lawyers who had once been his allies now avoided him in public. Rumors surfaced that members of the state's Judicial Committee were reconsidering their support for his promotion. Then came the headline. It wasn't a full exposé, not yet, but it was damning enough. The national paper ran a front-page article detailing patterns of questionable rulings and financial ties to wealthy developers. They didn't name the sources, but they did cite the retired clerk's documents. The city erupted. Talk radio hosts debated his integrity. Social media lit up with demands for an investigation. People began coming forward with their own stories. Small claims dismissed without cause, bias in sentencing, rulings that seemed to defy logic until you follow the money. The judge, of course, called it a smear campaign. He held a press conference, standing stiffly at a podium, claiming he had nothing to hide. But I saw the way his hand trembled when he gripped the edge of the lectern. The man who had mocked me in court was no longer smirking. I should have felt satisfaction, but what I felt instead was something colder, resolve. This wasn't over. If anything, it was only beginning. Because men like him don't fall in one blow. They stagger, they claw, they try to regain their footing. And if you give them a moment to breathe, they come back stronger. I couldn't let that happen. I coordinated with the single mother's son to file a formal complaint with the state's Judicial Oversight Board, using both the old case and newer examples as evidence of misconduct. The complaint triggered an initial review, a small step, but one that would open the door to a deeper investigation. The political endorsements he'd been counting on began to vanish quietly. No one wanted to be associated with a man under public scrutiny. The charity he sat on the board of announced he was taking a leave of absence to focus on personal matters. And then came the day I'd been waiting for. A sealed subpoena was issued for several years' worth of his financial records. It hadn't hit the news yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time. I sat in my car outside the courthouse, watching as he arrived for the day's docket. His stride was slower now, his shoulders slightly hunched. The robe that once seemed to give him an aura of invincibility now looked heavy on him, like it was dragging him down. It struck me then, this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about exposing a truth that had been hidden for decades. And when it finally came out, it would scorch everything it touched. The judge was cornered. The walls were closing in. But I also knew something else. A cornered man is dangerous. And if he figured out I was the one holding the leash, he wouldn't hesitate to try to destroy me. The real question wasn't whether he would fall. It was whether I could survive long enough to watch it happen. And that question would be answered in the final act. When the end came, it didn't come with a bang. It came with a slow, methodical unraveling, a tearing apart of man's image thread by thread until there was nothing left but the truth he tried so hard to bury. I woke that morning to the sound of my phone buzzing endlessly on the nightstand. Notifications stacked on top of one another, vibrating with the urgency of something big. My first thought was that I'd been found out, that the judge or his allies had traced everything back to me. But when I unlocked the screen, the truth stared back at me in bold, black letters. State judge under federal investigation for corruption and abuse of power. The article was everywhere. National outlets, local blogs, even international headlines. The investigative reporter I'd met in that coffee shop had gone all in. She hadn't just used my files. She'd expanded them, pulled records I didn't even know existed, interviewed victims who had been silent for decades, and connected the dots between his rulings and millions of dollars in property deals, political favors, and hidden accounts. Every accusation was backed by documents. Every claim supported by testimonies. It was no longer a rumor. It was fact. The fallout was immediate. The state's Judicial Oversight Board announced a formal investigation. The FBI confirmed it was reviewing financial records. The mayor's office issued a carefully worded statement expressing deep concern. But it was the footage from that afternoon that told me everything. The judge walked out of the courthouse flanked by two attorneys, his face pale and tight, his lips pressed into a thin line. Reporters surrounded him, shouting questions over one another. Cameras flashed like lightning. For the first time in his career, he didn't have control of the room. He didn't smirk. He didn't laugh. He didn't look anyone in the eye. He looked like a man who had just realized the tide had turned and there was no way back to shore. The charity cut all ties with him. His bid for the Court of Appeals was dead before it could even reach the committee. Cases he had presided over began to be re-examined, some overturned entirely. Former allies started making deals to save themselves, offering up information in exchange for leniency. And me? I stayed quiet. I watched it unfold from the shadows, never stepping into the spotlight. My name never appeared in a single article. Not once. And that was exactly how I wanted it. Because this wasn't about me becoming the story. This was about making sure his story was told the way it deserved to be told. Without excuses, without spin, without the insulation of power he'd wrapped himself in for so long. But there was one moment I'll never forget. About a month into the investigation, I received a plain white envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with only 3 words, typed in a bold serif font. You did this. No signature. I didn't know if it was from him, one of his allies, or someone else entirely. But I didn't care, because they were right. Yes, I did this. I thought back to that day in Courtroom 3B, the laughter, the smirk, the word this spat at me like I was less than human. I thought about the single mother who had lost everything to his ruling. The faces of people who had walked into his courtroom seeking justice and left with nothing. And I realized something. Revenge, when done right, isn't just about hurting someone back. It's about removing their ability to hurt anyone else. It's about creating a void where their power used to be, so they can never use it as a weapon again. The judge's resignation came 2 months later. He framed it as a decision to spend more time with family. But everyone knew the truth. Without his robe, without the bench beneath him, he was just another man standing in the wreckage of his own making. The federal investigation didn't stop with him. Several of his closest allies were indicted on charges ranging from bribery to fraud. The developer from that 23-year-old case lost half his holdings to a court-ordered restitution fund for victims of illegal property seizures. The single mother, now older, her hair streaked with gray, called me. She had read about the case in the news and wanted to thank me. Her voice was quiet, but there was something in it I hadn't heard before, closure. That was when I knew it was over. I never stood in front of the judge again. I didn't need to. The image of him stepping down from the courthouse steps that day, reporters swarming, his legacy collapsing around him, was enough. And yet, the lesson I carried with me wasn't about revenge at all. It was about patience, about resilience, about understanding that sometimes the only way to fight the kind of power that mocks you for the color of your skin is to take it apart piece by piece, until there's nothing left for them to stand on. The world would forget his name eventually, but they would remember the headlines. They would remember that a man who thought himself untouchable was, in fact, brought down, not by an army, not by some rival judge, but by the truth. And I'd remember that even in a system stacked against you, there are cracks in the foundation if you're willing to look for them. He mocked me once. He called me this. But now, every time someone spoke his name, it was followed by the word disgraced. And that was my justice. The air in the courtroom that morning was heavy, the kind of suffocating stillness you feel right before a storm breaks. The place was packed, not just with lawyers and reporters, but with everyday people who had followed my case, people who had seen me humiliated and mocked months earlier by the very man who was now being called to account. There were murmurs and whispers rippling through the benches, but the moment the judge, the former judge, walked in, those whispers faded into a tense silence. Edward Graves no longer wore the robe that once gave him the illusion of untouchable authority. Instead, he wore a tailored suit that seemed almost desperate in its precision, as if crisp lapels could cover the cracks in his reputation. But no amount of fabric could hide the hollow look in his eyes. I studied him the way you study someone who once held a knife to your back. You don't look away, not even for a second. The prosecutor opened with a litany of charges: judicial misconduct, abuse of authority, racial bias, and obstruction of justice. Each word seemed to chip away at the armor Graves had worn for decades. And though I knew justice was finally catching up to him, there was a part of me that remembered, vividly, the sting of his laughter, the smirk when he called me a waste of the court's time, and another statistic. The memory burned hot in my chest. I had been asked to testify again, not as the accused this time, but as the voice of every person who'd been crushed under his prejudice. I stepped up to the witness stand, hand steady but heart pounding, and faced not just the court but Graves himself. I want to tell you what it feels like. I began, my voice even but sharp, to walk into a courtroom believing in justice and walk out knowing you were judged before you even opened your mouth. I want you to understand the humiliation of being mocked, not for what you did, but for what you are. Every eye in the room was locked on me. I could see a few of the jurors shifting uncomfortably, as if the weight of my words made them sit straighter. When Judge Graves looked at me that day, I continued, he didn't see a person. He saw a stereotype. And because of that, he made choices not just against me, but against the truth. The prosecutor let me speak longer than expected, knowing that my testimony was doing something no piece of evidence could. It was humanizing the damage Graves had caused. By the time I stepped down, I didn't just feel like I'd spoken for myself. I felt like I'd spoken for every person who'd been silenced, dismissed, or ridiculed under his gavel. But the real storm came during cross-examination. Graves' defense attorney tried to twist my words, to paint me as overly sensitive, to suggest that I had misunderstood the judge's tone. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was the same tired playbook that people like Graves had relied on for years. "Let me be clear," I said, cutting through the attorney's rehearsed indignation. "A misunderstanding doesn't leave scars like this. What he did was deliberate. And you can call it whatever you like, but I call it what it is, racism." The silence after that was deafening. Even the court reporter's fingers paused over the keys. In the days that followed, the trial became the city's most talked-about spectacle. Reporters dissected every word, activists rallied outside the courthouse, and social media burned with debates. Some defended Graves, claiming his decades of service should outweigh his one mistake. Others, like me, knew this wasn't about one mistake. It was about a pattern. When the verdict finally came, the jury found Graves guilty on all counts. His sentence wasn't just prison. It was a lifetime ban from practicing law and a public record that would forever mark him as the disgrace he had become. Watching his face as the sentence was read was a moment I'll never forget. The arrogance, the smirk, the unshakable belief in his own power. It all collapsed. But even then, my work wasn't done. I used the attention from the case to push for judicial reform, to demand better oversight, and to speak openly about how bias in the courtroom ruins lives. I started programs for young Black defendants, offering legal aid and mentorship determined to keep others from going through what I endured. Months later, I got a letter. It was from someone I didn't know, a young man who had been sentenced by Graves years earlier. His words were shaky but heartfelt. "You don't know me," he wrote, "but you gave me my voice back. I watch your trial every day, and for the first time, I believe someone like me can win. Thank you." I sat with that letter for a long time, realizing that revenge had turned into something far more powerful. It wasn't just about making Graves regret his words. It was about making sure those words could never be used to hurt anyone else. And in the end, that was the truest form of justice. Because when they try to bury you with their prejudice, the greatest thing you can do is rise, not just for yourself, but for everyone still buried.